Manhattan stepped into mid-December with a cold white light cast across the cobblestone pavement and yellow taxis swarming like lost bees among the blaze of lampposts. Amid the hurried crowd, a black SUV pulled up in front of the Wessington Grand, a five-star hotel right on Madison Avenue, once described as a glass and steel marvel of the hospitality world. The car door opened slowly. An elderly man turned himself toward the exit, braced one hand against the thin metal frame, and gently slid into a matte black carbon fiber wheelchair. No one assisted him, but clearly he didn't need help. Every movement was precise, self-assured, so much so that anyone watching might assume he'd done this 1,000 times before. What no one, not a single staff member standing in that grand lobby, realized was that the man in the wheelchair was Victor Langford, co-founder, former CEO, the man once dubbed the architect of hospitality. It was he who, 30 years earlier, had sketched the first design for this very grand lobby on a napkin in a small cafe in Harlem. Victor wheeled himself toward the glass revolving doors. A security guard glanced at him. No nod, no step forward to open the door. Just a slight turn of the body, as if to block the way. Victor tapped gently on the glass in front of him, unrushed. His expression was calm, but only the truly observant would notice that his gaze held something between waiting and enduring. "The service entrance is across the street to the right. There's a ramp," the guard said, pointing without changing tone. Victor nodded, barely enough to be seen. He didn't reply, just slowly turned his wheels to the left, circling around the side of the hotel where the loading dock door was left ajar. Inside, the sounds of rolling carts, intercom chatter, and the heavy footsteps of the logistics crew echoed clearly. No red carpet, no piano music, no greeting, and no one. He quietly pushed his chair forward, his hands well accustomed to the effort. His dark brown leather gloves protected his palms, but couldn't stop the bite of cold from the metal elevator floor. A small plaque above the door read, "Not for guest use." Victor stared at it for a moment, then pressed the button for floor 1. The original blueprint from decades ago flashed in his mind. A layout with no such sign, where every hallway led to the heart of the hotel with no back route for those deemed unfit. But today he himself was directed to that very path. The hotel's main lobby came into view as the elevator opened from the inside, at a hidden corner near the ground floor bar. A bartender turned to glance at Victor, maneuvering his wheelchair toward the front desk. He said nothing, just nudged his coworker and mouthed something that made both of them chuckle. Victor heard the laughter, but he didn't stop. He didn't lift his head, just kept rolling toward the reception desk where 3 front desk agents were chatting with a well-dressed guest. The brunette at the counter, after sending off the VIP guest, glanced at Victor for a second and turned to her colleague beside her. "You handle it." "I don't have experience with this kind." This kind was never defined, but Victor heard it clearly. The front desk agent, Brandon, stepped forward with a stiff smile. "Hello, sir. Do you, have a reservation?" Victor reached into the small pouch hanging behind his wheelchair and pulled out a printed sheet. "Victor L., Executive Twin Room, 3 nights. Booking code WES-1912. Brandon took the paper without making eye contact. He typed, nodded. "Yes, it's confirmed." He turned and whispered something to the floor supervisor, a man around 35 with slicked back hair and a name tag that read, Craig. Craig approached. No greeting, no smile. He glanced briefly at Victor, then murmured to Brandon, "Executive twin? 10th floor. Main elevators are crowded. Take this gentleman through the kitchen route. Don't let the VIPs see him." Victor still didn't react, but this time, his eyes paused for a moment. His hands rested on the wheels, motionless. He looked into the mirror behind the reception desk, where the reflection of himself, silver hair, slightly hunched shoulders, a beige scarf around his neck, blurred in the shimmer of younger guests walking past. No one knew, no one guessed, and he didn't need them to. He wasn't here to be recognized. He came to observe, to remember, and to see how his brainchild, Wessington Grand, now welcomed the world. A young bellman appeared, pulling a luggage cart, eyes slightly impatient. "I'll take you to your room." He didn't ask any questions, offered no mention of special services, no options for assistance. Nothing of what Victor had once built into staff training programs over 2 decades ago. Just a simple task. Take him to the room, via the service elevator, through the back kitchen, down an empty hallway. No one asked if he needed anything else. The wheelchair glided down a black-tiled passage toward room 116. A low-ceilinged room with pale gray walls and a faint mustiness from the old air conditioning unit. No mirror, no minibar, no service guide. Victor reached forward, opened the door himself, wheeled inside and closed it behind him. A dry click echoed like the shutting of a memory. He didn't sigh. He simply pulled a small photo from his coat pocket, a picture of his sister Amelia at 19, sitting in a wheelchair, painting with watercolors. He placed it on the table, directly in his line of sight. The wind hissed lightly outside the window. But inside room 116, there was a silence no one else in the hotel could hear. The first night at the Wessington Grand passed in a strange kind of silence. No knock on the door, no service check-in call, no email confirming room readiness. Victor woke up early, not because the bed was uncomfortable, but because he couldn't sleep. His eyes opened in the dark, accustomed to the bare ceiling, where there should have been a chandelier, like the ones he had personally commissioned in his 2008 design update. He lay quietly in the low bed, hand resting on his chest, and remembered another night, 38 years ago, in another room, colder than it needed to be, at a time when the world around him had also gone silent. But unlike the stillness of today, back then, he heard the sound of a ventilator, rhythmic interruptions, and the whisper of a young woman, speaking through pain. Amelia Langford, his younger sister, had just turned 21. She was once a promising painter, known for her watercolors of window frames she saw through the hospital walls. Victor's memory preserved one image forever, a painting of 3 colors, sea blue, earthy brown, and pale yellow, where a window opened into an endless space, and light painted dreams beyond the edge of the hospital bed. But before the world could discover Amelia's gift, fate intervened. A car lost control on 4th Avenue just as she was crossing. The crash permanently damaged her spine. Within weeks, her entire world shrank to 4 wheels and a 3-meter radius around her bed. Victor, then a final-year architecture student, dropped out of his last semester to care for her. He worked part-time at a diner, took shifts at a parking lot, and occasionally sketched cafe layouts for small business owners. But what haunted him most wasn't the work. It was the night Amelia was denied service at an upscale restaurant on 9th Avenue, a place Victor had once dreamed of designing. They had a reservation. They arrived on time. But when they saw her in a wheelchair, the staff hesitated. The manager said, "We don't have a proper entrance." They were asked to return another day, when there's outdoor seating. It was November, 48 degrees. No one asked further. No one apologized. That night in room 406 of Roosevelt Hospital, Amelia looked at Victor and said, "They don't have to say I don't belong. They just have to look, and I understand." Victor sat beside her, holding her frail hand, bones visible beneath the skin. He couldn't say anything. Every word felt excessive. But then, near midnight, with only the ventilator's hiss and the ceiling light's quiet glow above, he whispered, "If one day I ever build something, I'll make sure no one has to detour or step back, just because of who their sibling is or how they sit." Amelia smiled, not broadly, just a slight curve at the corner of her lips. But it was enough to stay with Victor forever. 3 years after that night, after Amelia was gone, Victor designed the first blueprint for the Wessington Grand, a hotel model built around accessibility. Every doorway was at least 36 inches wide. Every public restroom had support bars. The main entrance, if you notice closely, was subtly elevated in the center, not to feel like a ramp, but like a natural gesture of welcome. He once told his architecture team, "People don't want pity. They want to be seen." But time passed. Victor stepped down as CEO after 27 years. The new board focused more on profit. The franchise expanded at lightning speed, and the human experience became more of a slogan than a core belief. He knew this, but he had never seen it with his own eyes. Until yesterday. This morning, Victor looked into his reflection in the small travel mirror he carried, not to fix his hair, but to ask himself, do they still remember why this hotel was built? No one had knocked on his door. No message came from the front desk. He looked again at Amelia's photo, nodding gently as if whispering to the past. All right, let's keep going. Victor put on his gloves, checked the tires on his wheelchair, and pulled on a thicker coat. Today he wouldn't leave. Today he would sit still, in places where no one expected him to be, to listen, to witness what had been forgotten beneath the mirrored walls, the polished surfaces, and the soft jazz tunes playing in the lobby. Songs he had once personally selected. No longer a CEO, no need to give a speech. Today he was just a brother who once took his sister out to dinner on a cold night and was turned away. He didn't come for revenge. He came to see, do they still remember the reason a door exists? Room 116 had no mirror. That was the first thing Victor Langford noticed on his second morning at the Wessington Grand. He had been sitting in his wheelchair for 10 minutes, quietly observing every detail in the room, from the pale gray light filtering through the heavy drapes to the floor tiles worn down at the edges, near the baseboards. But it was the absence of a mirror, a seemingly trivial item, that made him pause. Of all the hundreds of hotels he had ever visited, never had he encountered a room without a mirror. Not because he needed to adjust his face or hair, but because a space without a mirror is a space that denies people the right to see themselves. The room's telephone had no guest services button. Victor dialed the front desk. The line was busy. He tried again. Still busy. He looked for an information booklet, the kind that should be placed on the bedside table. But there was none. Instead, there was a faintly printed piece of paper with a single instruction. For assistance, please dial 0. He did. The call connected after 5 rings. A woman's voice answered, impatient. Front desk. Victor spoke calmly without introduction. I'm in room 116. There's no mirror, no service menu, and the bathroom floor has no safety grab bars. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then the voice resumed, now smooth as if trained. Yes, room 116 is part of the overflow area. Due to an unexpected surge in guests, we've had to open a few maintenance rooms. If you're dissatisfied, we can assist with early checkout and partial reimbursement. Victor said nothing more. He hung up. A hollowness crept into his chest, not from the lack of service, but from the quiet erosion of everything he had once built. This room was meant to be used by staff for temporary rest. No minibar, no ADA-compliant access, and clearly no one had inspected it before handing over the key. He opened the door and rolled out to check the emergency exit. There was a low ledge, just enough to catch a wheelchair if unnoticed. He made a mental note. Back in the room, he opened his laptop and logged into the Wessington internal system, using the high-level credentials he still kept, like a backup key for his conscience. Everything was still there, but now he could see clearly. It no longer reflected the reality behind the glass walls of this flagship hotel. Just then, a knock on the door. A soft, slow knock, not like that of housekeeping staff. Victor opened the door. It was Ellie, the young intern who had helped him yesterday in the service elevator. She stood there hesitant, holding a cup of hot tea and a small piece of paper. I'm sorry if I'm bothering you, but you looked cold yesterday. There was some ginger tea left in the kitchen. I brought it up. Victor looked at her. For the first time since arriving, he saw a face here that wasn't corporate. He took the tea silently. She turned to leave, but hesitated. I know this room isn't up to standard. They said it was the only one left. And I know you didn't say anything yesterday, but your eyes, they reminded me of my aunt. She used a wheelchair too. And she was once turned away from a fancy hotel, just like this. Victor nodded gently, saying nothing. She fumbled a bit. I just wanted to say, if you need anything, call me directly on this number. Don't use the front desk. She handed him a note with her internal extension, then walked off quickly, as if afraid of being seen. After she left, Victor looked at the small mirror in his coat pocket, a personal item he always carried, a quiet reminder. He placed it on the table. His reflection appeared, older, thinner, but still with that same gaze. the gaze that once watched his sister cry from being turned away. Suddenly, he looked around the room as if it were a model. Everything was wrong. The proportions were wrong, the lighting was wrong, the feeling was wrong. But the worst mistake, the biggest flaw, was that the original designer had assumed this room would never actually be used for guests. A room that was optional had become a dumping ground, and no one said a word. Victor noted each flaw by hand in an old leather notebook, not to file a complaint, but to correct the internal guidelines. Yet he knew the biggest revision wouldn't be on paper. It would be in how people were taught to see others. He rolled his chair closer to the window, where the curtains blocked all outside view. He gently parted the fabric. The view revealed itself. A section of the kitchen roof, a chimney, and the rear wall streaked with rain stains. This was what the room allowed guests to look at. A cage with no mirror, no sky, no door. And it was now being used to hold him, the man who had once signed off the budget for the building's grand facade. Victor closed his eyes and touched the cold wood of the window frame. "Amelia," he whispered, "if you were here, you'd laugh, and you'd say, 'At least now you've seen it.'" Part of him ached, but another part felt grateful, because he was seeing more clearly than ever. Not just the room without a mirror, but the way a system forgets why it was created. And he knew from that moment on, he would not leave this hotel until everything was seen again as it once was meant to be. Morning at the Wessington Grand looked like any other morning. The main lobby polished to a mirror shine, staff in black and white uniforms moving precisely like brushstrokes on a page. But as Victor sat in the lounge area behind the front desk, he realized that the gloss was just skin deep. Beneath it were fractures, quiet ones, that not everyone could hear. He chose a spot tucked near the vintage wine display, where he had a clear view of the reception desk without drawing attention. His hands rested calmly on the wheelchair armrests, eyes steady and unflinching. He wasn't here to wait for anyone. He was here to listen. There were 4 people at the front desk this morning. Craig, the morning shift manager, the same man who had dismissively ordered Victor to use the service elevator the day before, was standing behind the computer screen, fingers gliding through booking tabs. But his eyes were on the 2 younger staff nearby who were whispering and laughing. They didn't realize that Victor could hear them clearly. A young woman's voice. "Yesterday, there was some old guy in a wheelchair in room 116. Looked like a homeless guy got an upgrade." The male colleague snorted. "Right? I thought he wandered in by accident, probably tipping us with his gratitude." Craig laughed, not loudly but unmistakably. "Those people come to hotels like this hoping to get lucky. Maybe someone feels bad enough to give them a free upgrade. But here, not a chance." His last line was said with a note of pride, as if he were the gatekeeper of who deserved dignity and who didn't. Victor sat still. He didn't turn his head. He didn't react. But every word, every snicker, every glance, they all etched themselves into his memory. Not in a notebook, but in the mind of a man who once believed that your perspective is the first step in the guest experience. A foreign couple walked in, a Japanese husband and wife, probably in their 60s, speaking English slowly, asking about a city tour. Ellie was across the room, wiping down teacups and watching quietly. Craig stepped forward to greet the couple, polite but stiff. After they left, Craig returned and muttered, "That accent asking for a 5-star tour? I swear I need hazard pay just for international patients." Another round of snickers from the remaining 2 staff. Victor turned his chair toward the minibar lounge. He wasn't thirsty, but he needed a reason to leave the space now heavy with arrogance. A staff member approached and politely asked what he'd like. He requested only water. While waiting, he glanced into the mirror mounted on the marble wall, and in that reflection, he saw the 3 front desk employees still gossiping behind him. He couldn't make out the words now, but the glances, the lips, the stifled laughter said it all. They had judged him based on 2 things, his wheelchair and his worn coat. They didn't know who he was, and if they had, maybe they'd go quiet. But that was the real issue. Kindness shouldn't be rooted in fear, it should be rooted in understanding. And here, there was none. Victor didn't return to his room right away. Instead, he turned his chair down the hallway, leading to the guest common area, where afternoon tea and TV were offered. There he saw a group of elderly guests, likely tourists from the south, waiting to check in. Among them was a black woman in a long, soft pink dress, holding a cane and wearing reading glasses. The front desk agent remained behind the counter, pointing at the name board and speaking loudly. "Wait until your name is called to enter." The tone wasn't insulting, but it lacked any trace of warmth. The woman lowered her head, saying nothing, but her hand tightened around the cane. Victor paused. In the woman's eyes, he saw something that reminded him of the early principles that shaped Wessington's philosophy. That genuine hospitality never came from a printed script, but from how one looked another person directly in the eyes. But now those glances had been replaced by hurry, by programmed indifference. He looked back at the front desk. Craig was now standing with arms crossed, supervising from a distance. When a Middle Eastern couple approached to ask about spa services, Craig quickly put on a smile and stepped forward, completely different from how he had treated others just minutes earlier. It didn't surprise Victor, but it confirmed something deeper. The problem wasn't just Craig. It was the system that had allowed someone like Craig to remain in that position for far too long. He opened his phone and searched for the old document, Training Values 2003, a manual he and Amelia had written together in her final days. In it was a line he once thought simple: "Every guest is a mirror that reflects how the hotel truly sees people." Now there were no mirrors in room 116, no one to reflect anything back, and so the truth had been quietly buried. Victor opened his notes app and began typing. Audit the entire front desk training program. Review time spent on disability sensitivity and special service modules. Interview frontline staff. Collect feedback from guests who requested personal support. Each line felt like a hammer striking the concrete rot within a system he had once trusted. He knew that when this journey ended, it wouldn't be with a few apologies scribbled down. It would be a reconstruction, from the service elevators to the most luxurious reception tables. As he made his way back to his room, Ellie passed by. She almost greeted him, then hesitated. She bowed her head slightly and whispered softly as she walked past, I'm sorry." That was it. No explanation. No extra words. But in those two words, Victor heard everything. She had heard, and she hadn't laughed. That was the beginning. He returned to room 116. The room still had no mirror, but this time, he didn't look at the curtains. He looked at the phone, and he dialed a special internal number, a high-level Wessington line reserved only for former executives. The call rang through. He didn't speak when it was picked up. He simply let it ring, then ended the call, like a signal, like a reminder. "I'm here, and I've seen." On the third morning at the Wessington Grand, cold rain began to fall. The droplets splattered against the lobby's glass facade, as if trying to wash away the building's polished appearance. Victor Langford sat in his wheelchair near the entrance to the conference area, not to observe guests, but to watch how the staff behaved during peak hours. Today, a tech conference was being hosted in the fourth-floor ballroom, and the number of check-ins had tripled compared to usual days. Victor had booked breakfast at the rooftop restaurant, the very one he had invested over $1 million to redesign, with updated lighting and spatial flow. But he hadn't booked it as a CEO. He'd used the name Victor L., paid with his personal card, and requested wheelchair assistance, just like any other guest, with no authority. When he arrived at the main elevator area, the steel doors were open, but the elevator coordinator shook his head. "Sorry, sir. This elevator is prioritized for VIP conference guests this morning. Please use the rear access instead." Before Victor could respond, the staffer had already turned to greet a group of guests in suits, bowing politely. Victor didn't argue. He turned his wheels and headed toward the service hallway, the one marked "Authorized Personnel Only." No one stopped him. No one even noticed. The back corridor smelled faintly of machine oil. The pale greenish hue of the fluorescent lights made everything feel colder. The steel door to the service elevator creaked as it opened. The iron floor had streaks of cleaning chemicals, and an empty box of tissues lay crumpled in the corner. Victor rolled in and pressed the button. But just then, Ellie appeared at the end of the hall, holding a tea tray and a small bag. She froze for a moment when she saw him. They made you take the service elevator?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of concern. Victor didn't answer right away. He only nodded. She stepped forward quickly, placing a hand on the elevator button to hold the door. "I'll ride with you. At least, you won't have to go alone." They stood in silence as the elevator hummed and the light above flickered. Ellie whispered, "They're not supposed to do that. The guest guidelines clearly state that the main elevators are accessible to everyone." Victor glanced at her. "And do you think anyone actually reads those guidelines?" Ellie lowered her eyes. "I do. My aunt used a wheelchair, and I hate the feeling of being looked at like you don't belong." That made Victor look at her more closely, not as a hotel guest, but as someone who had spent nearly 30 years training personnel. She wasn't afraid of the truth. She knew right from wrong, but she didn't yet have the tools to speak up, and that wasn't her fault. The elevator stopped at the top floor. The door opened to a narrow hallway connecting to the restaurant's auxiliary kitchen. A kitchen staff member spotted them and frowned. "This route isn't for guests." Ellie stepped forward immediately. "I'm with the guest. He has a reservation." The staffer nodded his chin. "Make sure you clear it with the manager. She's strict." They said nothing more. Victor silently wheeled forward, passing through the side entrance into the rooftop restaurant. Inside, the warm lighting and smell of toasted bread almost erased the air of the service elevator. But no one in the restaurant acknowledged them. The restaurant manager, a middle-aged woman in a black suit, glanced at them, then turned away. No greeting. Ellie led Victor to a table near the glass, overlooking the Manhattan skyline in the rain. But the table was too low, the chair too tight. Victor couldn't roll his wheelchair close enough without bumping into the iron table legs. Ellie quickly moved the chair aside to make space. But just then, a young couple who had arrived later were seated at the better corner table, the one Victor had originally chosen. He didn't react. He simply watched them sit down, receive their menus, and laugh. A server brought Victor his menu 4 minutes later, just long enough to create psychological distance. Ellie whispered, "I'm sorry. I don't have authority over seating." Victor nodded. "You did the right thing. No one expects you to save the world, but just not turning away, that's enough." After breakfast, Ellie guided him back through the side hallway. But this time, before entering the elevator, Victor paused. He looked at the steel door. It felt like standing in front of a symbol, an invisible gate that the entire system had built to categorize guests, not through words, but through experience, through unspoken instructions, through glances, through the silence of misplaced convenience. And Victor understood. All the lessons he'd once taught, all the training slides, all the onboarding videos on hospitality standards were meaningless if doors like this still opened daily for the right people, but closed to the ones who needed them most. The service elevator door slid shut slowly. Victor said nothing. Ellie stood beside him, one hand resting on the now-cooled tea tray. Inside the elevator, the flickering light returned, and the faint whining of an old motor filled the cramped air. Its mixture of oil and lingering breakfast smells made the space feel displaced, like a forgotten basement inside a tower of glass. Suddenly, the elevator stopped at a middle floor. A woman entered, pushing a cart filled with clean table linens and a large water dispenser. She froze upon seeing Victor and Ellie, then gave a small bow. "Sorry, I didn't think anyone used this elevator outside shift hours." Victor nodded gently. The woman nodded back, saying nothing more. But in her eyes there was empathy, not pity, just recognition, as two people coexisting on the lowest tier of a system that no longer remembered its own name. When the elevator stopped, Ellie whispered, "I'm going to document all of this. I know if I stay silent, I'll become the kind of person my aunt used to fear." Victor didn't reply, but he turned and placed a hand on her shoulder. A small gesture, but enough to say, he heard her back in room 116. He removed his gloves, placed them on the table, and looked out the window. The rain still fell. The room was unchanged, still no mirror, no proper lighting, no familiar scent. But something was different now. Inside him, there was no longer a cold anger. There was something else rising, resolve. He knew service elevators wouldn't disappear on their own. People like Craig wouldn't just leave quietly. But if even one person was willing to ride with him in that elevator, then things could still be rebuilt from the bottom floor. He took out his leather notebook and added a final line under the heading, "Must be addressed post-audit. Erase all old internal directives. Rewrite the standards. From the basement up." Dinner at Belcourt Restaurant was usually the highlight of a stay at Wessington Grand, a place where Michelin three-star dishes were served under crystal chandeliers, accompanied by live jazz from guest musicians. Victor knew that well. He was the one who had invited the very first trumpet player to perform there in 2010, back when the restaurant first opened. But now as he returned, not as a founder but as an elderly guest in a wheelchair, nothing tasted the same. From the moment he called to make a reservation, something felt off. "You're dining alone? Let me check. Not sure if we have any low tables. I mean, suitable for assistive devices." Assistive devices. The words were spoken like he was a piece of equipment. Victor didn't react. He kept his tone even. "I need a table near the stage." The voice on the other end hesitated. "I'll check and confirm." But no confirmation ever came. And when he went in person to the host stand at 7 p.m., the exact hour he had once designated as the golden window for seasonal tasting menus, the answer was no tables available. The restaurant host, a young man with a close-cropped haircut and an earpiece, gave Victor a 2-second up-and-down glance before asking, "Do you have a reservation?" Victor gave his name. The host typed on his tablet, then frowned. "I don't see your name in the system. And tonight we're fully booked. No walk-ins." Victor stayed calm. "I called this morning. Perhaps the system didn't update." The host shook his head and turned to his colleague. "This gentleman says he has a reservation, but he's not showing up." The colleague glanced at Victor, then raised her brows at the sight of his wheelchair. He should have given advance notice. That corner table's been booked since the afternoon. No one apologized. No one offered an alternative. Victor gave a faint smile and said, "I understand," then turned away. Victor rolled his wheelchair away without another word. The glass door of Belcourt closed behind him, but the sound echoed like the shutting of an era. He rolled past laughing guests down the main corridor, then veered toward the employee dining area. A small auxiliary kitchen bore a sign, "Staff use only," but it wasn't locked. He pushed the door open. No one inside. A long, stainless steel table, a few plastic containers, an industrial fridge. He sat there. No menu, no chandeliers, just 4 undecorated walls and the buzz of fluorescent light. And paradoxically, he felt more at peace here than anywhere else in the building. Just then, a staff member entered, a petite Latina woman with her hair tied back, wearing a white apron and carrying a tray of untouched soup. She paused, startled to see him, and said softly, "I'm sorry. This is a staff area. I didn't know a guest was here." Victor nodded. "I know. I just didn't want to go back to the lobby." She hesitated, then gently placed the soup tray in front of him. "I made an extra for the night shift, but if you need it, please have it." Victor smiled almost imperceptibly. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Isabella." "Thank you, Isabella. This is exactly what I needed." Victor ate slowly. Each spoonful marked a quiet rhythm of time. No glitter, no grandeur, but real. In that hidden kitchen, for the first time in days, he didn't feel judged. He wasn't stared at. No one questioned whether he belonged. And it didn't come from the menu. It didn't come from chair designs. It came from a young woman who didn't know who he was, who simply saw someone needing dinner. When he left the auxiliary kitchen, night had already fallen. Victor didn't go straight back to his room. He circled behind the building to the staff smoking area. There, he overheard 2 maintenance workers talking about how the restaurant had kicked out some old guy in a wheelchair who wanted a table by the stage. One of them said, "Probably thought being old means people will give him stuff." "Not here. Class is class." Victor didn't interrupt. He heard enough, remembered enough, and returned to room 116, where no one was waiting. But he knew, tomorrow things would not be the same. Back in the room, Victor didn't turn on the light. He sat in the dark, his wheelchair in its usual spot, facing the blank wall where a mirror should have been. Outside, the headlights from passing cars shimmered across the wet pavement. It was still raining, as if the rain had never stopped. He opened his laptop, logged into the internal Wessington system, and pulled up the original design file for Belcourt. The old blueprint scanned from his own hand-drawn sketches. In the margin was a handwritten note. Stage tables must allow full 360-degree wheelchair clearance. Priority placement for guests requesting accessibility. The very first dinner at Belcourt, before it even had a name, was the year Amelia turned 22. They had sampled French-style braised beef from the new chef's test menu. Back then, the restaurant had just 6 tables, no chandeliers, no pianist. But there was one moment Victor never forgot. The look on Amelia's face when the server crouched down to her eye level and asked, "Would you like more pepper?" It wasn't a special question, but the way he waited for her answer, with his eyes, with time, with silence, that was how a person is recognized. Victor didn't dine at Belcourt tonight, but he had been served better than at any table out there, by a woman named Isabella, in a kitchen no one saw. And that didn't make him sad. It made him ache. Because kindness now had to be found in the shadows, while the spotlight shone on tuxedos and gowns, where emptiness was celebrated. He added a line to the confidential feedback journal, an access-only tool reserved for founding-level executives. Belcourt needs to remember its roots. Remove ranking-based table prioritization immediately. Retrain staff to recognize dignity, not status. Beneath it, he handwrote in his leather notebook, "Amelia never asked to be seen." But when she was, it changed her whole week. Then he closed the book and set it by the window. Outside, glasses were still being raised. But inside him, something had begun to rise too. Something that would not be turned back. Tomorrow he would do more than listen. Victor didn't return to his room right after dinner. For the past 2 days at Langford Regal, under the name Mr. George V, he had spent most of his time observing the lobby, the front desk, and the restaurant, places where he had once stamped his mark on the hotel's service culture. But tonight, what kept him restless didn't come from a cold glance or dismissive tone. It came from a dull ache in his chest. A name, Amelia. Amelia had once lived with him in room 214, a small suite on the second floor, overlooking the courtyard garden. It was there they first drafted the business plan for Langford Regal, scribbling notes on wall-stuck pages, arguing late into the night, then falling asleep to the hum of an old air conditioner. After the hotel expanded, the room was converted into an internal storage space. But Victor still remembered every tile, every faded stain on the ceiling. He called the elevator, pressed for the second floor, and slowly wheeled himself down the left hallway. His heartbeat slowed, as if each turn of his wheels was pulling him deeper into a part of his memory long sealed away. Room 214 wasn't locked. The door was slightly ajar, marked with a sign, "Maintenance, staff only." Inside was a small linen and supply closet, folding chairs, cardboard boxes, but traces of the old room remained. A corner wall still held the original French molding. A frosted glass panel reflected the yellow light like it had captured the past. Victor quietly wheeled in. In the far corner, beneath a wooden shelf, sat a dusty wooden box. He opened it. Inside, sealed in plastic, was a bundle of old documents, notebooks, handwritten menus from the hotel's early years, some faded Polaroids, and an envelope sealed tight with a note scrawled on it. If Langford ever loses its way. He knew that handwriting. It was Amelia's. He didn't rush to open it. Victor held the envelope in both hands, his fingers trembling slightly. The room seemed to fold in on itself. All the years chasing mergers, conferences in Dubai, Zurich, Tokyo, receded behind the thin layer of aged paper. He opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet, yellowed with time. Victor, if you're reading this, maybe Langford has forgotten what made it different. Remember those first nights when you invited even the janitors to sample new desserts? Remember that people never come to hotels just for beds. They come to feel they belong. If one day I'm no longer with you and the hotel you built can no longer hear its people, then listen in the silence. That's where the truth speaks loudest. A. Victor clenched the letter. His eyes burned. He didn't realize the night manager had been standing at the door. "I'm sorry, sir. You're not allowed in here." Her voice was sharp and formal. Victor turned, silent. He looked at her, then looked back at the room. "Sir, do you hear me? This is for staff only." He gently folded the letter, placed it in his shirt pocket, and with a faint smile said, "I used to be staff here." A long time ago. The manager froze. 1 second, then two. Victor left the room without hurry. He didn't look back, because what he came for was already carried within him. And from that moment, Langford Regal was no longer a place he managed. It was a place he had to rescue, from the very people the system had forgotten. Back in the elevator, he pressed for the third floor, where he was staying under George V. This time he wasn't in a rush. His left arm rested on the wheelchair handle, but his eyes stayed on the hallway of the second floor, where room 214 slowly faded behind the elevator glass. A thin layer of past had just been wiped clean, and he felt lighter, like he'd set down a weight long carried. The room he stayed in now was too new, too bright, too perfectly five-star. Everything was up to standard, but it had no soul. Not like room 214, where he once used his old blazer to block the AC vent because it was too loud, where he and Amelia argued over the TV remote because neither remembered where the batteries were, where Amelia lit a single candle to turn a store-bought pudding into a birthday celebration. Victor placed the letter on the desk, opened his notebook, and for the first time in years wrote by hand, "Langford is losing its soul, the quiet empathy it was built upon. Tomorrow I will no longer observe. I will listen, not through surveys, but with my eyes, my ears, and honest questions." He sat there for a long time. The night was quiet. Only the sound of cleaning carts in the hallway and distant elevator bells remained. In that stillness, he remembered a small story, something seemingly unimportant, from over 20 years ago. It was Langford's first Thanksgiving. Amelia was helping in the kitchen because the head chef had called off. A young housekeeper named Renee, only 3 weeks on the job, was assigned to deliver the main course to the presidential suite. But when she arrived, the VIP guests yelled at her for cold food and unprofessional service. Renee broke into tears in the hallway. No one spoke up, except Amelia. She walked straight to the guest door, knocked, and in a calm but unwavering tone said, "At Langford, we don't serve from fear. If you can't treat people with respect, the meal will go back to the kitchen. No charge." Then she took Renee downstairs, poured her a hot cup of tea, and said, "If they won't treat you like someone with a name, then use mine to keep going." That night, Renee didn't quit. She stayed. 15 years later, she became the head trainer for the entire Langford housekeeping division in California. Victor looked at the letter again. Amelia's voice seemed to echo, not in his mind, but in the little stories that lived throughout Langford. The very ones he had let fade beneath spreadsheets and quarterly reports. He picked up his phone. His fingers slowly found a name in his contacts. Chloe Granger, Northeast Regional Director of HR. He hadn't called her in 7 months. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. "Chloe speaking." Victor didn't say his name. He only said, "Tomorrow I want you to send me the list of all staff who resigned in the past 3 years under the label cultural mismatch, not through the system. Send it directly. And Chloe, don't ask why." The other end fell silent. Then came the reply, "Yes, sir." Victor hung up. He knew tomorrow would be long, but for the first time in years he wasn't afraid, because he had just found what Langford had lost, someone to believe in, even after they were gone. At 9 a.m. the next morning, an email from Chloe Granger appeared in the secure inbox Victor had created under his guest alias, George V. Subject line, "Requested file, strictly confidential." He opened it. Attached was a file named Departures Flagged 2019-2024.xlsx. The list was long, 137 names. Over 60% had been dismissed for the same reason. Incompatible with premium service standards. Some were flagged as too personal, talk too much with guests, or worse, inappropriately friendly. There were names he vaguely remembered, like Jonas Mill, once praised as the concierge floor's brightest smile in 2020, and many he didn't recognize at all because they had never made it to a boardroom discussion. Victor pulled his chair close to the window. He sat for nearly an hour without reading further, simply letting the cold, clinical descriptions settle over his memory like pebbles tossed into a still lake. Eventually, he circled 3 names in red. 1. Noel Johnson, housekeeping staff, terminated after a complaint for being too friendly with VIP guests. 2. Elias Chong, night front desk attendant, flagged for compromising the formality of the main lobby by telling jokes to younger guests. 3. Maya Boudreau, restaurant server, fired after only 3 weeks for failing to adapt to the pace of a European standard dining experience. He decided to start with Noel. Through the internal scheduling system, he found the current roster for each housekeeping shift. It wasn't hard to identify who had taken over Noel's route on the 6th floor. As the housekeeping cart was rolled out from room 602, Victor quietly approached. "Excuse me, I'm looking for a girl named Noel. I met her here last year. She used to hum softly while working." The woman hesitated. "Noel, she's gone. Let go. Back in January, I think. But I remember her. Brown skin, curly hair always tied high, used to call everyone sunshine. Guests loved her. But management didn't." "Didn't?" Victor raised an eyebrow. "Didn't like folks who work off script." She shrugged, then pushed her cart away, leaving Victor standing alone. That afternoon, Victor asked the front desk to call a taxi, something he usually didn't allow guests to do since the hotel had its own internal transport system. But today he wanted to leave. He wanted to find Noel. A call to an old contact in HR revealed Noel was now working at a laundromat in the suburbs. Victor went unannounced. The cab dropped him off in front of a small store named Lily's Linen. The sign was worn, but the door was open. Inside, a young woman was folding towels onto a shelf. She flinched slightly at the sight of Victor, then moved to help him with his wheelchair. "Can I help you, sir?" Victor looked at her. "Noel Jansen?" She paused. "I'm Noel. Do we know each other?" Victor didn't answer right away. He met her eyes. There was no fear there, just the gaze of someone who had been hurt but hadn't lost her kindness. "May I speak with you for a few minutes? I used to work at Langford." She nodded and led him to a small corner table, 2 metal chairs and a chipped teacup. He told her that he'd once been part of that hotel, that he was now doing a study on hotel culture and wanted to hear stories from those who had left. Noel looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke. She told him she had once loved working at Langford, that she remembered the names of every guest in rooms 621, 624, and 628. She remembered which wax scents they liked, how she folded towels just so to make them smile. One day she was quietly humming while cleaning a room for an elderly guest, and the woman cried. "That's the song my husband used to play every morning," she said. But 2 weeks later, management called Noel in and placed a disciplinary report in front of her for violating conduct standards and making guests uncomfortable with non-standard behavior. "No one asked why I was singing," she said with a sad smile. "No one asked if the lady had complained. They just enforced the rule." Victor had no words, but he asked, "If invited back, would you want to return?" Noel looked out the window, where the sunlight was starting to fade. "I don't need to return to housekeeping, sir. I just want a place where I won't be fired for making someone feel something." Victor nodded. He left without saying who he was, just left a small slip of paper with a phone number. No name. That night, Victor sat alone in his hotel room. Amelia's letter lay beside him. On the table was the list of names no longer present at Langford, but whose marks still lived on in ways no HR report could reflect. He knew. Tomorrow he would find Elias, then Maya. But he also knew this was no longer an investigation. It was a return. Langford at night retained a haunting elegance. Soft amber lighting stretched from the grand lobby all the way to the doors of Le Chien restaurant, like the lingering warmth of a candle that refused to burn out. But within that beauty, something was hidden, as if every laugh, every spontaneous gesture had been sealed behind glass, polished just enough to preserve dignity as someone had defined it long ago. Victor sat alone in the ground floor lounge. In his hand was a folded printout, Elias Chong's internal evaluation file, the former night shift receptionist dismissed over a year ago. The final line read, "Pleasant demeanor but lacks restraint. Storytelling style inappropriate for brand tone." What story exactly was inappropriate? Victor remembered Elias, a slim young man, Asian features, always with a sincere smile, bright eyes that often lowered whenever he passed by senior leadership. Victor had seen him once, late at night in 2021, after a board meeting. Elias had just greeted an elderly couple with a light joke about the lobby being as cold as a Canadian freezer. The woman burst out laughing. Her husband nodded, calling Elias the kid who knows how to warm up a cold night. Weeks later, Elias was gone. No questions asked, no reports filed. Victor stood and called the elevator. This time, he was determined to go to the root. Elias now worked at a small public library in Eastwood, a modest neighborhood less than 20 minutes from Langford. A friend in IT had quietly shared the location, with the note, "He's never badmouthed the hotel, but he's also never mentioned it again." That afternoon, Victor went to the library. No escort, no security staff. Just him and his wheelchair, still bearing a small scratch on the left wheel from the previous day's misstep. The room was silent. A little girl read a picture book. An old man snored softly on a wooden bench. And behind the checkout desk stood Elias Chong, now wearing thick black glasses, hair longer, but that unmistakable smile still there. Victor approached, pausing just before coming into view. He adjusted his collar, tapped gently on the desk. "Good afternoon. I'm looking for a book, but also someone who once told a story I haven't forgotten." Elias looked up, his eyes wide. Not from recognition, but from hearing the word story. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Victor didn't answer immediately. He looked around. Everything here was simple, warm, unpolished. And suddenly he understood why Elias had chosen this place after Langford. "Can you spare 5 minutes? Not to lend a book, but to tell a story you never got to finish." Elias nodded hesitantly. They sat in a small corner by the window, where late afternoon light filtered through the leaves. Victor told him he had once been part of the Langford system, that he was working on a project to understand the invisible mistakes, the quiet cuts that bled out a company's soul. Elias didn't smile, but he spoke. The night story, the elderly couple, the freezer joke, was true. They laughed, lingered for 10 minutes, but a mid-level manager walked by and saw Elias chit-chatting too long. A note was filed. 2 days later, the culture compliance team called Elias in. A pre-written memo, a recommendation to resign quietly if he wanted his final paycheck. "No one asked if the couple had complained," Elias said. "No one asked why I liked the night shift. Why I remembered the guests in 414, Victor didn't know what to justify first. A flush of shame crept up his neck. Someone like Elias had been pushed out of the system for delivering something that couldn't be scripted. Warmth. "What can I do for you?" Victor asked, for once abandoning the voice of investigation. Elias shrugged. "You don't need to do anything for me. Just, if you can, don't let people disappear just for being real." When Victor left the library, the sky had turned amber and red. He said nothing on the ride back, but in his mind he was already rewriting the very rules that had erased so many kind souls from Langford's halls. That night, in room 902, Victor opened the minibar and pulled out a cold can of sparkling water. And for the first time in years, he opened the voice recorder on his phone and spoke. Not for documentation, but for himself. "Tomorrow, Maya Boudreau. Tomorrow it's time I face what I've let slide for far too long." 9 a.m. Monday. The lobby of Langford froze in a strange state of anticipation. Whispers spread like invisible wind. Rumors of an emergency executive meeting, talk that Maya personally summoned all department heads, but no one really knew what was going on. Outside the main boardroom, high heels clicked, phones buzzed, and glances darted. Everyone waiting for a bomb that hadn't yet gone off. Then the doors opened. An assistant stepped aside as a wheelchair rolled slowly into the room. A brown tailored coat, a composed face. No power makeup. It wasn't Maya. It was Victor Hale, the CEO, who hadn't been seen at Langford in person for 3 years. The room went dead silent. Someone dropped a pen. Maya Boudreau, standing near the presentation board, quietly set down the remote. Her expression didn't flinch, but Victor noticed the subtle pulse in her neck. She wore a navy blazer, the color of control. Victor tilted his head slightly, saying nothing, as his assistant pushed him to the head of the table. No one knew he would be here. And no one knew. This moment would begin the unraveling of Langford's power structure. "Thank you for coming," Victor said evenly. "I'm sure you're wondering why I'm here." No one answered, only the soft scratching of pens. Maya laced her fingers together and nodded subtly. Victor opened a folder, not financial reports, but printed internal complaints, unofficial HR memos, and thank you letters from guests. Letters that had been purged from the CRM system for not aligning with brand tone. "I only have one question," he said, eyes locked on Maya. "At what point did Langford decide that elegance meant apathy?" No one laughed. No one blinked. Maya answered in her familiar voice, soft but made of steel. "I believe you're referring to the brand consistency initiative we co-signed in 2021 to ensure guest experience uniformity, regardless of shift or personality." Victor nodded lightly, then slid the folder to the center of the table. "We called it consistency, but what we created was erasure. We erased real people. People like Elias Chong, Noel DeWitt, Andre from housekeeping on 15. They didn't leave Langford. They were pushed out." A cough came from the far end of the table. A department head shifted in his chair. "Mr. Hale," Maya said, still not glancing at the documents, "I understand your concern for individuals, but to operate a system like Langford, we need rules." Victor sat taller in his wheelchair. His voice sharpened. "What rule allows a manager to scold a new employee for making a bed too soft? What rule tells a young woman not to smile at guests because she's been deemed insufficiently upscale? What rule keeps people who know how to operate a camera, but not how to read another human face?" Maya said nothing, but many around the table were beginning to shift in their seats. Then Victor offered something unprecedented in Langford's history. "Starting tonight, I am initiating a 48-hour experimental program. No ranks, no tiers, no brand slogans. Every employee, from security to supervisors, from chefs to front desk, will be invited to speak at an open forum in the grand lobby." A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Maya smiled faintly, but it was the smile of someone who knew control had just slipped. "And where do you think this takes Langford?" she asked. Victor answered without hesitation. "Back to where it belongs. Trust." The meeting ended in silence. But down the hall, out in the lobby, murmurs were already growing. Small groups of employees leaned into one another. Everyone knew something was about to happen. Not a new memo, but something stronger. A showdown between two visions, one rooted in rigid systems, the other in real voices. Victor returned to his room. He didn't eat lunch. He simply opened his voice recorder and spoke a single sentence. "Tomorrow they will no longer be afraid." He sat by the window as the afternoon light streamed through the curtains. He didn't eat dinner either. He only requested a hot ginger tea, the same thing Amelia used to drink, his wife who passed away 4 years ago. No one at the hotel knew, but it was Amelia who laid the first bricks of Langford's human values. She once said, "Elegance isn't in silk, it's in how we kneel to see eye to eye." Victor opened a drawer and took out an old recorder. He pressed play. A faint voice emerged as light as wind. "If you can still hear me, don't let the kind be dismissed. Langford isn't for the perfectly polished. It's for those who know how to reach." He closed his eyes. No tears fell, but the air in the room thickened, like grief taking shape without a sound. At the end of the hallway on the 9th floor, near the executive boardroom, a night shift worker named Millie stood against the wall. No one usually noticed her, but she'd heard everything, not intentionally, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. She had once been reprimanded by Maya for letting a guest open their own door. She had almost quit. But now something had returned to her eyes, a flicker of belief. Tomorrow the entire staff would be invited to the grand lobby, not to listen, to speak. And for the first time in years, Langford would have a night where the night shift wasn't forgotten, because the one at the top had finally listened. Langford's grand lobby stayed lit through the night. For a full 48 hours, shift schedules and break times were restructured so that every staff member, from servers, front desk, housekeeping, security, kitchen, to IT and accounting, could attend the shared assembly. There was no long table, no stage, just a circle of chairs and a wireless mic passed hand to hand. Department heads sat beside valet drivers. A former PR manager sat beside a young line cook. Victor didn't sit in the center. He chose a quiet corner with a small notebook and a pen. No one was forced to speak, but when a young laundry worker named Eliza stood up, her hands still trembling, and said, "I used to think my voice didn't belong at Langford because no one ever heard me finish a sentence." The room went completely silent. One person stood up, then another. No one spoke for long, but each voice was a missing piece the system had ignored. Andre, the room attendant fired for inappropriate attitude, shared that he once left a condolence card for a guest who had lost his wife over the holidays. It was the first time that man had cried in 7 months, but the card had been flagged as an unprofessional personal gesture. A maintenance worker named Jorge, whose name most had forgotten, spoke about how he'd been told to wear full uniform coverage and stay out of the lobby area because his tattoos hurt the brand image. Then Laura, the assistant chef who'd been reassigned to a different shift for not having the right greeting energy, stood up and broke down in tears. "I don't need anyone to greet me. I just want someone to say, 'Your food is good.'" Each voice changed the air in the room. Former leaders, the ones who once set the rules, now sat with their heads lowered. But in the middle of the second sharing session, just when everyone thought they had heard it all, a rough voice echoed from the back. "I'm sorry if I'm not saying this the right way. I've never spoken here before." Everyone turned. It was Millie, the night shift worker, 58 years old. She had worked at Langford for 11 years. No one really knew what she did because she worked after everyone else had gone home. "Someone once told me I didn't need to smile, just mop the floors, and I believed them. But I think I was wrong." No one dared breathe too loud. Millie held the mic with both hands and looked around the room. "I've seen Langford become beautiful, not because of velvet rugs or imported flowers, but because of honest people, because of that front desk girl who asked for 10 minutes to call her mom in the hospital, because of that young security guard who gave his umbrella to a guest in the rain, because of Laura's soup, because of Elias's eyes. I don't hold any title, but I remember those little things. And if we forget the little things, this hotel is just a fancy glass box with no soul." The room rose in applause, not the kind stirred by fleeting emotion, but the kind that erupts when someone finally speaks the words everyone had feared no one would ever say. Victor closed his eyes and smiled. Millie set the mic down and stepped back, not bowing her head but holding it high. For the first time, Langford's spotlight wasn't on a tailored suit or a designer handbag. It shone on a wrinkled face, tearful eyes, and a quiet but real pride. The final gathering didn't happen in the boardroom. It happened right in the main lobby, once cold and impersonal. Victor stepped into the crowd, standing for the first time without his wheelchair. With crutches on both sides, he trembled, but stood firm. "I've heard you, not just with my ears, but through all the time I spent hiding my name among you. And I realized Langford doesn't need a new value statement. We just need to remember why it once felt warm." He turned to Millie. "Starting next week, I'm proposing a new position, the keeper of memory. No degree required, only a heart. And if you'll accept, Millie, you'll be the first to hold that title." Millie froze. Then she smiled, her lips quivering. The room erupted into applause once more. Victor turned to scan the space. So many faces he had once seen only in silence. Now they had spoken. Now they had been seen. They were Langford. And that was the moment when no one needed logos, no slogans, no performance metrics. Just a glance that said it all. "I see you, I hear you, and now Langford belongs to all of us." December in New York is usually gray and cold, but somehow the sky that day had a gentle warmth to it. At the Langford Hotel, once described as a luxurious but silent fortress, unusual sounds began to stir. Laughter echoing in the staff stairwell, soft jazz flowing from the pastry kitchen, and quiet but steady conversation in what used to be a hollow corridor. The silence had been replaced, not by noise, but by life. Victor descended from the top floor office. For the first time in nearly 7 years, he didn't need anyone to push his wheelchair. The 2 solid wooden crutches at his side had become a new symbol, not of injury, but of a will in recovery. He wore a dark wool coat, no tie, and no entourage. He walked slowly through each department, kitchen, laundry, housekeeping, front desk. Wherever he went, those who once avoided speaking lifted their heads and smiled. No one stood stiffly. No one bowed deeply like before. They simply nodded, as if greeting a colleague who had returned. When he reached the main lobby, where the 20-foot glass doors opened onto Madison Avenue, Victor paused. Outside stood the press, corporate partners, and industry delegates. They wanted him to announce a rebranding of the Langford legacy, expected a bold message, a new marketing strategy. But he just smiled softly, and instead of stepping up to the podium outside, he turned around and stepped onto a small platform inside the lobby, beneath a bronze plaque that read, Langford, where every person is seen. Victor stood before the mic, no script in hand. To those watching Langford closely, we won't be launching a flashy campaign. No new logo, no shock discounts. We're making just one promise. From today onward, everyone working here, from the newest hire to the board of directors, has the right to speak, to be respected, and to be remembered. He turned to Millie, who had just officially assumed the position of cultural memory keeper, the first in the company's history. We may not be the most luxurious hotel in the city, but if you're looking for a place that truly listens, we welcome you with both hands and with all our heart. The doors of Langford swung open, but this time, the first person to walk in was a 10-year-old boy, wearing a hoodie, holding a letter addressed to his mom, a waitress at the hotel. No one stopped him. A female manager knelt down gently and asked, "What do you need, sweetheart?" The boy smiled. "I don't need anything. I just wanted to say thank you to my mom and to this place for making her smile again." The entire lobby went still. Victor watched the scene, then turned and walked away, leaving all the attention behind. He no longer needed to control everything. Langford now had a heart of its own, and beyond those open doors was a city unchanged, but with people who had begun to change. After the brief but powerful speech, Victor didn't return to his office. He stepped down into the lobby and stopped at what was once called the restricted zone, reserved for VIP check-ins. That day, he ordered all partitions to be removed. In their place, the reception desk was moved to the center of the lobby, where anyone could approach to talk, ask questions, or offer suggestions. That very afternoon, a whiteboard was placed in the staff hallway with a large message. What would you change to make Langford feel warmer? Below the question were dozens of handwritten notes. More laughter. Fewer pointless meetings. Chairs for housekeeping staff. A real break room, not an old air-conditioned storage space. All responses were saved, compiled, and published weekly in a new internal bulletin called Langford Listens. Millie, in her role as the memory keeper, began visiting each department to document moments worth preserving, from a staff member gifting a homemade cake to a colleague, to a valet remembering the name of a regular guest. No one required her to write reports, but each month a new honor board was posted, not based on KPIs, but on humanity. Victor knew not everyone would understand or believe in this change. Some investors pulled out, a few former managers resigned, but he remained unshaken. On his final day before stepping down as CEO, Victor hosted a small farewell gathering. No champagne, no red carpet backdrop. Just a long wooden table in the main kitchen where everyone brought homemade dishes. No one wore suits. Some wore aprons. Some still had flour on their hands. But no one felt out of place. The atmosphere felt more like home than a corporate entity. Victor raised a glass of water, eyes gleaming. I may no longer be CEO, but Langford doesn't need a single CEO. Langford needs many people who keep promises. And today I believe you will keep them. Not because I ask you to, but because each of you once needed someone to listen. After a long round of applause, Victor stepped outside. Near the edge of the lobby, a new staff member, Malik, who had only been there 2 weeks, approached, a bit hesitant. Mr. Carter, I just wanted to say, thank you for not being like what I imagined a big boss would be. Victor laughed. He patted Malik on the shoulder and said his final words before leaving. Maybe I'm not the big boss, but I'm the first one to say, I was wrong, and I'm willing to start over if it means someone else gets to stay. The door behind him closed gently. No fanfare, no music. But within everyone's heart rang something unmistakable. Truth, kindness, and the rebirth of a belief. If you've ever been misunderstood just because you weren't loud, flashy, or didn't fit the mold, remember, you still deserve to be heard. Share your story or the story of someone quietly extraordinary you know down in the comments. It might be the one thing they've always longed for someone to notice. And if you believe in small stories that move hearts, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Our journey is far from over, and people like Victor, like Millie, are still out there, waiting to be told.